And a very pleasant good morning to everyone listening. It is Saturday, it's Sunday. I got my days mixed up. It is Sunday morning, and we are here for the debut episode on our brand new YouTube channel, the Connoisseurs of Wrestling. This is a channel that's going to be devoted to all things about the history of professional wrestling, the richness, the glory of it, the fun, everything that made us fans. And speaking of fans, our host with the show, the indomitable godfather of podcasting at Caveside Seats, the one and only Taker's minion. Taker, my friend, good morning. Hope you're doing well today.
Good morning. I am. It was a long night last night for me, so you folks are going to have to bear with me. I haven't slept, and I'm doing my second podcast in 2 days, which is no big deal. How be things with you there, Mr. Biff?
Well, there's, there's the long version and the short version. The short version is this has been quite the catastrophic weekend. Dealt with the death in the family, dealt with all sorts of tomfoolery from friends who are being little jerks this morning, trying to get everything squared away. But you know what? I saw this podcast here. It was a beacon of light in a sea of storms. And we've got such a wonderful topic today, something that's near and dear to both our hearts. You know, we love our history, we love wrestling. And this is one of the great figures of wrestling history that we have to cover today. The late, great Bruno Sammartino. Now, Taker, Bruno, I don't believe ever had a major impact in the AWA or out in the Midwest, but
I did see him.
okay, then I was about to say we do have someone here in Bruno who definitely left an impact during the 60s, the 70s, and even into the early 80s. What were your first memories of Bruno? Where did you first get a chance to watch him? And what were your first impressions, really, of a guy who many people consider to be one of the greatest of all time?
Bruno is the greatest of all time, head and shoulders above everybody else. My first impressions of him was when I first saw him on my local UHF channel. Now, folks, this tells you just how old I am. We had VHF and UHF, and you had the rabbit ears on the TV, and it was black and white, for God's sake. I saw him. He was doing a match in Indianapolis. It was in a gymnasium, high school gymnasium. You could actually see the basketball nets. And this was a guy that was huge. I mean, he was built, you know, and he was short and stocky. He was only, I think he was what? He was 5'10", weighed 265 pounds. He was built like a linebacker, a modern day linebacker. Okay.
Yeah.
And he just had this aura about him. And I was just like transfixed on watching his match. He won, of course. He was wrestling a local jobber, but, you know, and then they had an interview with him, and he was just so soft-spoken for a guy that size and as powerful as he was. He was very, very soft-spoken. And that was one thing that always attracted me to him. Humble and soft-spoken man throughout his entire career. You know, he's known more for his Worldwide Wrestling Federation, Vince Sr.
Right.
time. But he was loaned out to others, you know. He stepped away from there for a while and was working out of Canada, and then started coming down to the United States and working for the old territory system. So I saw him like in 1972, and he'd already been at it for, 13 years at that point.
Something close to that, yeah. And it's interesting. I want to bring up a point that you mentioned, how he's kind of built like a linebacker. We have to really clarify here, especially during Bruno's big run in the WWF, beginning in 1963. He really was kind of breaking the mold when it came to championship figures. You know, and I was hoping that we could talk a little bit about that here. Bruno was really one of the first power wrestlers to be given a chance to run on top of a promotion. Now, if you look at the history of the NWA and the AWA particularly, really your champion was more kind of the classic shooter mold. You know, your Lou Thesz, your Pat O'Connor, your Buddy Rogers, guys who are in great shape, but they weren't exactly what you would consider big men, power lifter types. Bruno was really one of the first men to really exemplify the power wrestler in the role of a champion. And I wanted to talk a little bit about that. Of course, with your background in the Midwest, with big time wrestling, with the AWA, with Dick the Bruiser, Vern Gagne, these types of athletes, how does Bruno stack up when you compare him to some of the great classic in-ring wrestlers that you grew up on?
Well, Bruno fit the mold, the prototypical mold of the time of the barrel-chested power wrestler, from the same mold of Dick the Bruiser and the Crusher, for that matter. Crusher was no slouch either, but he was someone that took time to work out. I mean, when he came here from the United States, or came here to the United States from Italy after World War II, which that's a whole other subject we'll get into during this show. He was the quintessential 95-pound weakling that we used to see on the back of the comic books. The Tony Artetti Atlas ads for you can get a body like this. He was the quintessential 95-pound weakling, and he'll tell you so. And he was a great wrestler, power wrestler. His finishing move was a bear hug more often than not. He would ragdoll people. He's was the only one to pick up Haystacks Calhoun and body slam him.
That's quite a feat. That is quite a feat if you remember Haystacks Calhoun. That was not
about 600 pounds.
Yeah, so I mean we're talking about a lot of man there with Haystacks Calhoun. But that really exemplifies, I think, what Bruno kind of stood for. He was kind of that Superman come to life figure, capable of feats of strength that no one else in wrestling could do at the time. And we are talking about someone who at one point did set a world record. I believe it was for a 565-pound bench press.
Yeah, and he did it 5 times.
That's impossible. That is impossible strength. For someone whose max was 275 one time, Bruno would eat me for lunch. He would eat most people for lunch too, I believe. So, but we're talking about someone who wasn't just, a gimmick in wrestling. This guy was legitimately tough. He was legitimately strong. And as you alluded to, Taker, it really didn't begin like that for him. He had a very hard life early on, and I guess that's a great place to jump in. If you've never gotten a chance, there is some limited editions available of his original autobiography. It was written in the late 80s, and it covers this in even more detail. And, of course, if you watch the documentary on the WWE Network, or if you've looked up some of its information online, some of this is out there. But one of the interesting stories about Bruno early on in life was his experience in Italy during World War II. Bruno recounts in his autobiography the story of his mother having to escape from Nazi soldiers trying to bring food back to some of the refugees from their village who had taken flight after the Nazis came in and took over their town.
Peso Ferrato.
Yeah, and
Peso Ferrato is the name. That's his hometown in Italy. And
yeah,
I'm sorry to jump in like that on you. I apologize.
Oh, no, I was just interesting kind of going back and looking at some of the stories that they recounted trying to escape from the German soldiers. This was not, your everyday run-of-the-mill childhood here for Bruno. I mean, he's coming of age at a point in time where his life is very much in danger, along with that of his family and the rest of his village. And so, it really plays into, I think, the mindset that you need to take everything one day at a time. You need to be thankful for every day. He definitely would use these experiences to kind of forge an iron will that would really dominate his career and his life, as long as he lived. But, can you imagine growing up under the specter of war, and especially World War II? It's just incredible some of the stuff that he lived through.
I mean, to be driven from your own home by the Nazis who used your home basically as a barracks and a headquarters space of some sort. To have your your father is here in the United States trying to get the money together to bring the rest of the family over from there, and the war breaks out. So immigration is closed; they can't get out. So it's his mother, his brother, and two sisters over there during this wartime, and to be cut off from their father when a man in a situation like that. I know I would. I don't know about you, but I myself, I know I would be wanting my father to be there to protect me.
Absolutely.
And she had already lost two children, and she swore after she lost her second one, she wasn't going to lose anymore. And during this time, while they were in the mountains, and Bruno got seriously sick, seriously ill with rheumatic fever, I believe.
Yes.
And survived that. This is, the conditions. And I mean, in the one video, there's a couple videos I've watched about him. I've been doing a lot of research on Bruno since we decided on this subject. And there's a video on YouTube called La Mia Mama. And what it's about is about Bruno's mother. It was done for Mother's Day. I don't even know exactly what year it was done. But Bruno goes back to his hometown in Italy and goes back to up into the mountains where they were. And it affects him in such a way that, he becomes very, very emotional. And you can see it's very, very difficult for him. But he drew a lot of inspiration from his mother's work ethic and ethic of raising those kids and making sure they were fed and risking her life to make sure that those children were fed and taken care of. I mean, he tells a story, and you mentioned it, that she had to escape from the Nazis. Yeah, she had been captured. And she jumped out of a truck that was moving and into a bunch of rose bushes and thickets to save herself and her children, to get back to her children. That's how obsessed she was.
You could almost make a movie about their life in Italy during World War II. I mean, some of the stories recounted are just so moving and so impactful.
They're hair raising.
Yeah.
To be honest, I mean, I was sitting there watching it. At points, I was crying because I'm sitting there go, how could a man go through so much like this and not be bitter, not be angry, not be, being humble? You want to learn how to be humble? Watch Bruno.
Yeah. And I think that was the most interesting dichotomy of his character as a professional wrestler. I mean, he was the quintessential hero. I mean, the quintessential babyface, the quintessential idol for kids and, older fans alike. Everybody.
He was a big time Italian American hero.
Yeah. And I think that when you look at the humbleness of his character, the humbleness of the man, it kind of almost lulls you into believing that he was kind of this gentle giant in the ring. When you watch Bruno, when he got the dander up, he got really angry. There were some boots to faces going on that would make any brawler today proud. He could really throw it down when he needed to. And that's the great dichotomy of Bruno Sammartino.
He could shoot with the best of them. Bruno could shoot with the best of them. You start shooting on him, he was going to kick your ass. And he talks about that in one I was watching. He said the biggest, he doesn't know why. He didn't like Playboy Buddy Robert. He didn't like Nature Boy Buddy Roberts, and Nature Boy Buddy Roberts didn't like him. He never knew why. He said there was just something about him he didn't like. He never explained what it was. He said, I don't know what it is. It's just, we've all had that, Pete. We've all had that. Ladies and gentlemen, we've all had that, where there's just something about a person we don't like. We can't figure it out. We just don't like said person, period.
My person is Dennis Cout. No, I'm just kidding. But, you do talk about, complete clash of personalities. Buddy Rogers, a kind of a showman, the flashy type, the guy that basically was the forerunner to Ric Flair, even in nickname. And then you have Bruno, who is basically the embodiment of humility. And it really comes from not only his upbringing, but kind of the work ethic that you mentioned he picked up from his mother. Just that constant fight for survival, even as he immigrated to the United States after the war. Very sick, had to take up bodybuilding, not even just as a hobby, not just as a way to repair the damage to his body, but to kind of defend himself from bullies that were taking advantage of his malnourished frame.
Right. Well, he talks about that too. He said it was one of the kids. He's like, kids are cruel, and they are. Even today, kids are cruel.
Yeah.
One of the kids in the neighborhood broke his nose. And then a friend of his took him over to the YMCA and introduced him to the weight room. That's where Bruno got his start. I believe he was 11 or 12 years old. And he said he became obsessed. He wanted to be healthy. He wanted to be strong. He wanted to not ever get sick again and be in a position where he cannot defend himself.
And it's really interesting how quickly this really came together for him. Of course, Bruno was born October 6, 1935 in Italy. He immigrated to the U.S. after the war. He set that bench press record in Pittsburgh in 1959. He was, 19 years old when he set that record. So from a start of 11 or 12, in just 7 to 8 years' time, we're talking about someone who had gone from being very sickly and very weak to one of the strongest men on the face of the planet. That's the kind of work ethic that we're talking about here. There are people that train their entire lifetime and never achieve what this man achieved. And as soon as he had set his world record, he was off into the world of professional wrestling. So
yeah. Well, and the thing about it is, because of today's times, ladies and gentlemen, Bruno was natural.
Yes.
He was all 100% natural. No juice of any kind. And anybody who says he's on the juice, if I ever meet you, I will punch you in the mouth. That's how much respect I have for this man. He gained my respect as a little kid in 1972. 7 years old. He had my respect because of what he was, because of how big he was and what he could do. I mean, he could take phone books, 4-inch thick phone books, and tear them in half like they were paper, like it was a regular sheet of paper. That's strong.
That is very strong.
Bending 1/2-inch steel bars like they were child's play. That's scary strong.
That's freakish strength. Yeah. And that just kind of goes to show you again, for someone that, by this point, once he's, kind of gotten into bodybuilding and he's really developed himself into a true power lifter, it just goes to show, he could have had a chip on his shoulder from all of his experiences, from the bullying that he received when he got to the States, or just thinking of the horrors that he lived through in Italy during World War II. But he never lost that humbleness, that humility. He never allowed his new physique to really dominate him like it could have so many others. He could have used it as a chance to get back at the world that had really deprived him of any sense of normality, that normalcy that we all crave. He took that experience and he just forced himself into a man's man. That's really what Bruno Sammartino is during this era. He is the embodiment of a manly man. And that's something that we don't see very often these days. That sort of masculinity is almost viewed as toxic in our modern society. Yeah. Bruno was a man's man. And, you could trust Bruno to keep to his word. He had a moral code that he lived by. And he wasn't going to break that for anyone. And I really appreciate and respect a man that sticks by his morals, even when it may not be the popular decision or it may not be the best decision for business. For Bruno, we're talking about someone who would eventually, break with the company that he basically put on the map because he didn't agree with the direction they were going. He forsook a lot of money because he had a moral code that he lived by, and he believed what wrestling should be, and he didn't believe in the direction the company was going when he left. And so you have someone that has certain moral fortitude here to make the tough call, even when it could hurt him financially or emotionally.
No. And the one thing he does say, and one thing I've read, is that he never had an actual ink to paper contract.
It was the strength of his word.
It was a handshake deal between him and Vince Sr. and him and Vince Jr. as well, and every other promoter in the country. Was a handshake deal. He felt, and this is something that you talk about him being a humble. I've talked about him being humble as of you. Bruno felt, as a top guy in any promotion that he was working in, that it was his job to make sure the underneath guys got paid better.
Yes.
If they weren't getting paid better, he would go talk to the promoter, because these guys would come to him and talk to him. He would go talk to the promoter. These underneath guys, these prelim guys, they work just as hard as I do, and you're not paying them well enough. And the promoter would say, okay, yeah, I'll take care of it, Bruno. Following week, they come, the guys that talked to him before would come back to him and say, hey, this is what I got. It's still the same. It hasn't changed. Bruno was so powerful in the business as he went along in his career, and he became a very powerful man in the business, that he could go, he was getting percentages of gates before that was even heard of.
Yeah.
That was, he was getting 5%, 10%, sometimes 15% of gate receipts. That's a lot of money for a 10,000 seat show. The gate's $50,000. He's getting 10% of that, $5,000.
Yeah.
Okay. He wanted to make sure that the boys were took care of. And he would go in and say, okay, this is what I'm making. Do I have to start making demands or threaten to leave to get these guys paid? And the minute he would threaten them with that, the underneath guys would get better pay. He felt that was his job as the top guy.
Yeah, and I want to point out something that you just said. I want to ask you that question in response. You look at Bruno and how he kind of took an active role as a leader in the locker room. Would you be willing to say that Bruno Sammartino kind of represents the transition from the classic NWA or AWA champions into kind of a modern era where the champion is not only representing, the best of his profession, but he's also kind of a caretaker for the business.
Yes.
Kind of looking out for his fellow participants, because like you said, Bruno would threaten to walk if the people underneath weren't taken care of. And that really strikes me as a modern type of attitude for a champion to take.
Yeah. And he was a man ahead of his time. We're talking, he's doing this in the 60s and the 70s. Okay. We're talking 40 years, over 40 years ago, he's doing this. He was a man in a wrong era. I mean, you bring him, let's say we bring a Bruno Sammartino, the young Bruno Sammartino into wrestling today. Okay. He would get over big. He would get over now. Why? Because of the way he was. He may not get over with the fans right away, but he would be over in the locker room because of how he was. It didn't matter. Heel, face, it didn't matter. He wanted everybody to make as much money as they could. And if he was top guy in that promotion, he would walk if they didn't. And he would threaten to do so.
Yeah. And it's interesting, we talk about a man out of time, kind of before his time, really. It's interesting, to note his first professional match on record, Dmitry Grabowski. He wrestled in Pittsburgh on December 17th, 1959. And so we're talking about an early career here that stretches only about 4 years between his debut and his first world championship. He beat his first opponent in 19 seconds. And so there again, you talk about being a man ahead of his time. Obviously people take a look at this guy and they just see them as a mauler, someone that's just going to blow through people. It really kind of highlights just how special this guy was and kind of how formidable he was from an early age. He began his career in the Pittsburgh area, and he would be wrestling for Vince McMahon Sr.'s Capital Wrestling Group. But it would not last for long. He actually had a bit of a falling out with Vince McMahon Sr., had different machinations on where to go. Of course, Bruno would kind of be loaned out all over the world. He would wrestle in Japan during his championship run. He would wrestle out in San Francisco, Los Angeles, Houston for a very infamous run that Bruce Pritchard recounts later on in his career.
Yeah.
But really where he made his big name was in Toronto, working for Frank Tunney.
Yeah.
And it was in Toronto.
Well, let's set the baseline as to why he had to go to Toronto. Okay.
Had a pretty substantial falling out.
He not only that, he to this day, in his in his own book, he wrote an autobiography because there was a double booking incident where he missed a shot in Baltimore.
That's right. You're right.
And the Maryland State Athletic Commission, because back then the athletic commissions of the individual states were involved in professional wrestling. No longer, because it's no longer quote unquote a sport. It is sports entertainment now.
Right.
Big difference. And Maryland put him on suspension. And everywhere he went, that suspension would follow him. He was like blackballed from wrestling in the United States. So he went back home and was learning to be a carpenter.
Yeah. Yeah, and it was only by chance that he wound up getting an opportunity to wrestle in Toronto, which is kind of
Eric was the one who called him.
Yeah, it was kind of saved his career, basically. He was going to be on the outs with every major promoter here had he not gotten a chance to succeed in Canada, but succeed he did. And yes. It's interesting that, one of the reasons he succeeded in Toronto was the Italian population in that city, and that really kind of set the stage for what would be, over the next 25 years, really, kind of the story of the WWF and their success, building on strong immigrant champions, drawing on immigrant populations in the Northeast that would come out to support their big wrestler. And you watch some of the documentaries on the WWF during this period, every major ethnic group seemed to have their guy. For the Italians, it was Bruno. For the Puerto Ricans, Pedro Morales. His name escapes me now. For a Greek wrestler, Spiros Arion, I believe.
Yes.
He was, kind of the hero to the Greek population in New York. And, of course, the famous story of one Terry Bollea, when he came in, he was given an Irish nickname so that he could appeal to Irish Americans living in New York. He became Hulk Hogan. That's why Hulk Hogan's last name, is not Bollea, it's Hogan, and that was given to him because they were trying to draw on Irish fans that would come out and watch him perform. And so you almost have like the old city-states here of different population groups here that are supporting their different wrestlers. Bruno was brought in to, attract Italian fans living in Toronto. He would follow that same model when he came back to work for Vince McMahon Sr. in New York and Washington. But honestly, Bruno's appeal would far exceed that of his contemporaries. He was really someone that everybody could get behind. He was the quintessential hero of this age. And when he comes back from a very successful stint in Toronto, it does not take long for him to really begin his run to the top. And that run to the top goes to a man we mentioned earlier, Buddy Rogers. Taker, do you have any memories of Buddy Rogers? And can you kind of give,
very, very vague. All I know is he was someone that I particularly didn't care for. I didn't like his attitude and whatnot. I mean, he won the title in Chicago, and to a nicer man, it could have happened. That right there, or to a nicer guy, it couldn't have happened. And I'm like, you bastard. And I'm 7, 8 years old, right? You bastard. I didn't like him. I didn't like him. And when I heard that Bruno had defeated him, I was happy.
So basically, what you're saying is he was doing his job as a heel.
Yes.
He made sure that people didn't like him. It wasn't like today where the heels all get cheered because they're cool. Buddy Rogers was, to quote,
he was the Miz of his era.
Only not as likable. Yeah.
Yeah.
He was definitely cocky. You wanted to see him get beat. And of course, this is the great thing about pro wrestling. Our stories dovetail into even deeper stories. There's tremendous controversy and a lot of intrigue over the championship situation that wound up creating the WWF championship at this period. Buddy Rogers is credited as the first WWF champion. There's an entire story that we could get into in a later episode about, how that championship came into existence. As usual, it was a dispute among promoters, and
it was. And then Vince broke away.
Right.
Vince Senior broke away.
And he created his own championship. And this is the formation, really, of what would today be known as the WWE. But Buddy Rogers did not hold that championship for long. The championship was awarded to him on April 25th, 1963. Less than a month later, he's dropping that title to Bruno at Madison Square Garden. That match was over in less than a minute. So Bruno Sammartino, from almost being blackballed from professional wrestling to winning this championship, just demolishing poor Buddy Rogers.
Well, like I said, this goes back to this is after, Vince McMahon Senior was trying to get him to come back. And he told Vince, the only way I'll come back is if he gets a title match against Buddy Rogers. And it was supposed to have been a match where Buddy Rogers won. Well, Buddy Rogers and him talked briefly, and Buddy Rogers said, "Don't worry about it." Sammartino locked a bear hug on him, and that was the end of it. And it was 48 seconds that he defeated Rogers in that first match, May 17th, 1963. Well, I can't say I was happy because I wasn't around then. But I had seen, after I got when I got older, after I gained all the respect I had for Bruno, I recently went back and looked at it, and I'm like, this was your atypical squash match. The wrestlers went in business for themselves. Vince wanted Rogers to win, and the wrestlers said, nah, bullshit, because Rogers already knew of the reputation and the fan following that Bruno had, and Buddy Rogers knew what was good for business.
It was one of the most interesting title matches in the history of the company, and it was honestly one of the first too. So it kind of gives you an idea of how, much intrigue was surrounding the situation. You got to give it to Buddy Rogers. He knew where this was going.
Oh yeah,
and I'm sure Vince Senior would not be complaining hereafter, because really Bruno winning this championship would embark on one of the all-time great runs in the history of professional wrestling. 2,803 days he would hold this title from May of 1963 to January 18th, 1971. We're talking about a guy that was facing some of the best competition in the world of his era. And, we could rattle off so many names and so many characters that deserve their own spotlight. Gorilla Monsoon, of course, legendary broadcaster in the 80s. He was one of the big monster heels that Bruno would tackle. Of course, the late George the Animal Steele, another prominent heel that Bruno would fight during his first championship run. You have guys like Don Leo Jonathan. You have all manner of people, especially in the 60s when we're still talking about the heyday of the NWA. The AWA has just gotten its birth here several years prior. It's now coming into its own. And now the Worldwide Wrestling Federation in New England. This is really kind of the peak of what you would consider to be the territorial era. You had 3 major promotions in different parts of the country. And then within the NWA, you had all sorts of smaller territories, mainly in the South and Midwest. But you had so many different styles, so many unique different ways of doing business, and so many unique characters during this period too. Guys like the original Sheik, Eddie Farhat. Just, an incredible array of talent all over the country. And here in New York, you have Bruno Sammartino, the strong man, that's, almost a superhero come to life. He's almost a comic book character with his incredible strength. And it just goes to show, just how much variations there was in professional wrestling. And, you could talk a little bit about your experiences growing up as a fan, watching your home promotions, Taker. Bruno Sammartino was a completely different beast from a Vern Gagne or a Nick Bockwinkel.
Yeah. Yeah. When AWA would bring Bruno in, he was here to take out the top heel. That's what his job was. He never was really in the title picture per se, but Vern would bring him in because Vern was a champion for a lot of years in the AWA. This goes back to the trust issue, which was something that was very, very low during the territory days. Trust was something that was almost non-existent between wrestlers and promoters, and promoters and promoters. And wrestlers trusted one another enough to know that they're not going to be intentionally injured. But in that match, you mentioned that where he lost the title, that was the match where Bruno's neck got broke. If I'm not mistaken, I think it was Koloff who broke his neck. No, it wasn't. It was Stan Hansen.
Stan Hansen. Yeah, he had a match with Stan Hansen and took a body slam wrong, and he broke his neck, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, and it was an accident.
Right.
But when he lost to Ivan Koloff, there was absolute the Madison Square Garden crowd was basically silent.
Right. It's the famous story where he took a flying knee drop off the top rope and he got pinned by Ivan Koloff, and he had thought that he had ruptured an eardrum because you could hear a pin drop in the Garden. People were so shocked that he lost. I think the only equivalent really to kind of gauge this type of shocked reaction would be WrestleMania 30 and the shock on the fans' face, and Undertaker lost his streak to Brock Lesnar.
Exactly. That's what I was thinking.
Yeah, that legendary moment.
Yeah. Having seen, like I said, one of Vern's top heels was another WWF star that would come in from time to time, was superstar Billy Graham. And Bruno and Graham had some of the greatest matches in Chicago. And I was lucky to have gotten to see one. I don't remember much. All I know is they both were bleeding pretty bad when it was all over.
Superstar Billy Graham was definitely a target of Bruno's wrath. They had some really great brawls.
Well, because Superstar was one of those juice users.
Yeah, culture clash, definitely. Kind of old school versus new school.
Yep.
There was an old Coliseum video release back in the 80s. It was kind of packaged with Inside the Steel Cage called The Greatest Grudge Matches. And Bruno and Billy Graham would have just some of the most hellacious matches. We're talking Bruno just putting boots into Billy Graham's face, hard way, and bruising him up. These two just went out and beat the living snot out of each other.
That they did.
But that was the beauty of it. You could buy into it because, Bruno, the quintessential strongman, could also get down and dirty in a street fight when he had opponents that were roughnecks. Yep. If you had a George Steele or a Billy Graham, do very different type of
Ivan Koloff or Dominic DeNucci or
Stan Stasiak,
Killer Kowalski. Hell, even Stan Hansen, or I don't know if he ever faced Bruiser Brody, but he would hold his own with somebody like that too.
Oh my God! Can you imagine Bruiser Brody and Bruno Sammartino?
That's scary. There wouldn't be an arena that could contain it.
That's the old Jim Ross euphemism. How would you rather be killed, with a knife or a gun? Oh, good Lord. Yeah, Bruno and Brody, that would have brought the house down. You talk about a contrast in styles there.
Mess.
Uh, I want to bring up a subject, and speaking of Undertaker, this is a good time, I think, to bring this up, Taker, because you have kind of a perspective on wrestling. You have both, what you grew up watching, you have a lifetime of experience, and of course, I think everyone that's around cage side seats knows that you have a tremendous appreciation for the Undertaker. We're looking at guys like Undertaker, Hulk Hogan, Bret Hart, Shawn Michaels, in their own generations, in their own ways, who would kind of become cornerstones for the company. Right now, The Undertaker kind of best exemplifies that. He's the bedrock of modern WWE. You're looking at these foundations, these cornerstones that the company was built on. You really can't bring up that topic without speaking of Bruno. Where do you see Bruno Sammartino's legacy in the WWE, now? What he did during his heyday, how it stacks up with some of the great superstars that would come after him. Is Bruno still the greatest in your mind? Is he been surpassed, or do you think his legacy kind of remains intact just by the value of what he did for the company? How does he measure up to an Undertaker or a Hulk Hogan type figure?
That's a tough question, but I'll try my best to answer it as objectively as I possibly can. My appreciation and love for The Undertaker is unquestioned by anybody. No, I've never been questioned as to about it. Undertaker is one of the cornerstones of the modern day WWE. Hulk Hogan is a cornerstone from a different era of WWF. Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels are also WWF, but they're a weaker cornerstone together. Even though they're cornerstones, a building only has four corners.
Right.
But I can say, how about I say this? I'll put it this way. Bret and Shawn each have a corner of their own, but the bedrock of WWF, WWE is Bruno. He is the bedrock of all of it. He was your first white meat baby face that was the true hero of not only Italian Americans, which is what they initially targeted. He became the white meat baby face to everybody. He was the everyman's hero. It didn't matter what you were. It didn't matter if you were black, white, yellow, green, blue, purple. It didn't matter. You were seeing Bruno is Uno signs from African Americans at Madison Square Garden. People would spend their money to go see him at Madison Square Garden. He's still, to this day, and I've checked it, I gave some erroneous information to you when we were first discussing this topic. Bruno sold out the Madison Square Garden a record 187 times during his career. That is a record that I think will never be touched. His run as champion for the company will never be touched. Because he has two reigns, and it's over 4,000. It's close to 4,000 days. It's over 4,000 days. It's 4,000 and close to 4,040 days.
Yeah.
There will never be another champion in WWE that'll ever come close to that. That's why I say Bruno is the bedrock. the rest are riding, even today, are riding on his shoulders. Even though he is gone from this world, he is the one still holding the cornerstones up today.
It's interesting that you brought up how long he held the championship. Of course, Bruno's first reign at 200 or 2,803 days is by far the longest in the history of the company.
Yeah, it was 7 years and 8 months, people.
Yeah, 7 years. And it's interesting and it's fascinating and mind blowing all at once. Not only did he have that reign, he would have a second championship reign that would go down. Now, this is kind of tricky because Bob Backlund's title reign has a kind of a fluky area where he dropped the title, but it wasn't recognized. And so it kind of separates kind of like at the 2/3 way point of his reign. But officially, Bruno Sammartino has both the first and the fourth longest championship reigns in the history of the company. His second reign, 1,237 days. That's over 3 years of championship run just on his second reign. His second reign was nothing compared to his first, but his second reign is one of the all-time great runs in the company's history all of its own.
Yeah, 3 years, 4 months, and 20 days.
So you're talking about somebody who had an enormous amount of faith placed in him to run the ship, as it were, not only in the 60s and into the 70s, even as late as 1980 and 1981, Bruno Sammartino was still considered a headline attraction. You're talking 20 years being on top of a company, transcending really some of the big names of that era. You have Andre, you have Bob Backlund in the later 70s, Dusty Rhodes coming up for different shots down from Florida. And you've still got Bruno, who is having amazing matches with guys like Stan Hansen and Larry Zbyszko. And we'll obviously have to
get into that. We'll get into that.
Yeah. We've got to talk about the Hansen match, and we've got to talk about the Zbyszko match. And I think what we're going to have to do, there's just so much to cover. His run in the 1980s is so interesting in and of itself. We're almost going to have to save that for a later episode because these two matches that we have to get to, Stan Hansen and Larry Zbyszko. And I think a lot of people know about the Larry Zbyszko match because it's a very famous angle, and it kind of served as really the transition into the 1980s for the WWF. But his match with Stan Hansen was just as, powerful, just as much vitriol in that match.
Oh, yeah.
And you brought it up, the famous incident where Bruno got his neck broken by Stan Hansen. And because Bruno is a real man and is basically pure testosterone, he comes back from a broken neck and he just beats the ever-loving crap out of Stan Hansen in one of the great matches in history of Madison Square Garden. I know that you have some memories of Stan Hansen. Stan Hansen was a big name out in the Midwest, especially in the 1980s. Tell us a little bit about your memories of the Lariat, Stan Hansen. And we actually have a bit of a technical snafu here. So let me go ahead and break it down here. Stan Hansen, one of the toughest individuals that you will ever see in professional wrestling. Mick Foley recounts the story of Stan Hansen in Japan, kind of taking him under his wing. Really, Mick Foley owes a lot to Stan Hansen. Without Stan Hansen, there's a very good possibility that we don't have Mick Foley in his career. Stan Hansen was legally blind. he was legally blind, and you hear some of the old timers talking about stories of Stan Hansen kind of throwing haymakers in there, and you had to kind of watch out. And Taker, you have probably a lot of memories of Stan Hansen. What was he like watching wrestling as you were growing up?
Stiff. He was one of the stiffest workers I ever saw. But he comes from an era where, what they call it over in Japan is strong style. We had a lot of that here in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s. We had a lot of strong style, hard-hitting, stiff workers. And it was slowly changing here in the States, and that's the reason why Hansen and Brody went over to Japan. They were more appreciated because of the style they used in Japan than they were here. But Hansen was a stiff worker. I mean, not that he was unsafe. You know, his vision, he has said it before, his vision is so bad, you know, and, you know, he would aim for a person's chest and usually damn near take their head off and hit him in the neck. And it was not something he would do intentionally. It was just that he would have the arm too high. He said that more than once. I said, it's nothing I ever did intentionally.
Well, you would hope that you didn't do it intentionally, because if there's one guy you didn't want to piss off, it's Stan Hansen. Stan Hansen was, you know, he looked like he came out of a biker bar in East Texas, and
he did. But he was also a football player.
Did he go to? It was the same college.
Him and Brody went to the same college. A lot of people don't know that Brody is college educated.
Yeah, it was West Texas State, I think it was.
Yeah, I think it was West Texas State, which became University of Texas El Paso.
Yeah, a lot of wrestlers. You could go through an entire episode of just wrestlers that played football in Texas. But this particular school put out so many great champions in the 70s and 80s. And, you know, Stan Hansen was one of those. You know, a very prominent member of the AWA. And, you know, there's a famous story about the falling out that Stan Hansen had with Vern Gagne. He was one of the biggest American stars to ever wrestle in Japan, had a great working relationship with Giant Baba and All Japan Pro Wrestling. Really one of the first big modern American superstars in Japan in the 1980s. But Stan Hansen, at this point in the mid-70s, was still very much getting his start in the business. The incident with Bruno took place in, I wanted to say 1976. Yes. April of 76. Match where he got his neck broken. Now, if you want to hear, you know, the toughness of Bruno, he came back from a broken neck in 2 months.
Well, there's a story behind that. Bruno, his doctors were telling, you know, because word got to his doctors in Pittsburgh through the nurse that was in his room, because Bruno was like in traction. And Vince kept calling because this rematch that took place at Shea Stadium that year was also on the same closed circuit undercard of the Muhammad Ali and Antonio Inoki match.
Right. Very famous match in and of itself.
Yeah. So, and Vince kept wanting Bruno to come back so they could announce this rematch. And the doctors wouldn't clear Bruno. Bruno's doctor, the specialist would not clear him. And make a long story short, Bruno somehow was able to get cleared because Vince assured the doctors that Bruno wasn't going to be really put in any risk. And he did the shot. I think the match lasted 3 minutes and Bruno won. You know, and then he went back and he stayed out for quite a while after that.
Yeah, it's incredible, his dedication to the business, and really just that work ethic that we brought up. This, you know, the quintessential man that's going to go out and he's going to do his job because that's his responsibility. Mm-hmm. He had the company on the back of his shoulders, even into this period in the late 70s where, you know, with the injuries that he's acquired over the years, he begins slowing down a little bit. He's still one of the biggest draws in the company. We're getting in now into the era of the Bob Backlunds. Even Superstar Billy Graham's run has kind of ended at this point. Bruno winding down, but he has one more legendary feud in his first part of his career. He's got a couple of feuds in the second part that we can get to in a later episode, but we cannot talk Bruno Sammartino without mentioning Larry Zbyszko.
No.
Now, Larry Zbyszko is a character unto himself, and he was a protege of Bruno Sammartino. And I know that you've got to have some Larry Zbyszko memories to share with us, because Larry, not only considered a living legend in his own right, the master of the stall. How annoying was Larry Zbyszko to watch? He was so annoying that even some of the old AWA referees used to want to beat him up.
Yep.
So,
you're not going to get an argument out of me there. You know, people complain about Bobby Roode being the rest hold expert. Larry Zbyszko can keep you in a wrist lock for 15 minutes. Because Zbyszko, I'm sorry, yes, he was trained by Bruno, but I don't ever really think that while he was being trained by Bruno, his heart was in it.
Well,
Zbyszko, I think, thought that there was big money to be made because at this time Bruno had the big car, the big house, and the Rolls Royce, and the pool in the backyard, and all this stuff. He saw the money. He didn't see the work that went into it, the years and years and years of work. Because this was like in the late 70s that Larry came to work or came to learn from Bruno.
Right. He spent several years actually as kind of understudy, both behind the scenes and on camera, of course, both being from the Pittsburgh area.
Right. Right.
So there was kind of that hometown connection there with Larry Zbyszko. But they were positioned on camera. Bruno and Larry was kind of his pupil for years, actually. And then as time went on, Larry Zbyszko kind of grew envious of being in that shadow. He kind of grew envious of being in the shadow of Bruno Sammartino. And that became one of Bruno's last big rivalries, his last big run for the main part of his career. A very famous episode of Championship Wrestling involving a match, I believe it was in Rochester or Allentown. It might have been Allentown, Pennsylvania.
The infamous chair shot from Zbyszko to.
Yes. And I have to be honest with you.
With a wood, not a steel chair, folks. Those steel chairs will do damage, but this was a wooden folding chair that when you hit somebody with it, it will crack your skull and leave splinters behind.
One of those old balsa wooden chairs, yeah, and just cracked his skull. And of course, Bruno has kind of, a mini afro going at this point. He's got, the hair, and Bruno had a very distinctive look, especially later on in his career. He was, always barrel chested. He was always short and stocky and that kind of, power lifter build. But, at this point too, he's getting a little bit older. He's a little bit slower, but he can still obviously go in the ring. And then here comes this young upstart, Larry Zbyszko, and they have what's considered a scientific wrestling match. And Bruno was basically outclassing Zbyszko. Zbyszko can't get an upper hand. At one point, he has a move. Bruno sidesteps him. It sends Larry crashing outside through the ropes. He holds the ring ropes open for him, and then Zbyszko just goes to town with the boots. He completely turns on him.
Yep.
And the famous shot where he cracked him in the head with the wooden chair. And Taker, I got to be honest with you. Seeing this as a kid, I was about 7 years old when I first saw this.
You were heartbroken.
It scared the piss out of me.
Yep, and then you're sitting there crying because Bruno's getting killed.
Well, it was. You got to understand something. This was probably
there were fans in that television studio that were crying.
Oh,
both men and women were crying.
Yeah,
this goes to show you just how Bruno as a person was such a hero to everybody.
Yeah.
Throughout his entire career, Bruno was never the heel. Never, ever the heel. He was the quintessential face his entire career, and it worked.
Yeah, it was like watching a hero be beaten down. And we had seen Bruno been beaten for the championship. He had lost the title twice. The injury from Stan Hansen where he broke his neck. But this was really one of the most, despicable acts committed against Bruno to that point. and it was a gory blade job. One of the bloodiest angles that I can remember, especially from this era, on WWF programming. There was a famous still shot on the Best of the WWF Volume 1 from Coliseum Video in 1985, where they had a picture of Bruno being picked up, and his face is just the quintessential crimson mask. And so, Larry Zbyszko would need arm protection going around after this, but you just knew that Bruno was going to come back and destroy him. And so we get the famous match, Showdown at Shea, one of the big super cards, the first big super card of the 1980s.
After the biggest match after Hansen and Bruno at Shea.
Right. So there was
4 years in the making.
Yeah, Bruno had several big matches at Shea. The match with Stan Hansen, obviously. Of course, the match we're talking about now with Larry Zbyszko. He actually had a really legendary match with Pedro Morales at Shea Stadium as well, when both men were baby faces.
Yep.
And
it was a solid match too.
Yeah, I think it was a 60 or 90-minute time limit draw.
I think it was 90. Yeah, I think it was 60-minute draw.
Yeah, well, Pedro and Bruno going 90 minutes. Good Lord. Let's hope it was a 60 minute.
Although back then they could.
Oh, they could, definitely. That's definitely an interesting clash of styles with Pedro and Bruno. But
both of them were barrel-chested strongmen, but Pedro was like 5 inches taller. Something like that.
Yeah, so Bruno getting a chance to work underneath there. The match at Shea Stadium in 1980 with Larry Zbyszko, that's really one of the highlights of Bruno's career. And it was also kind of interesting in the sense that it was really one of the last big hurrahs, not only for Bruno in his main career, but also for Larry Zbyszko. Zbyszko would be moving on from the WWF after this, and he really would never return. This was pretty much his swan song. He would go and make a name for himself, of course, in the AWA, and he would have a few cups of coffee in the NWA later on.
And with WCW, for that matter.
Oh, especially yes, and especially as a commentator for WCW, and he'd have a couple of matches, and of course the famous Wrestle War '92, the War Games match where he whacked poor Bobby Eaton. I love me some Wrestle War '92. We'll have to cover that show eventually, but
yeah,
this is almost kind of the end of an era, because on the same show that Bruno Sammartino gets his revenge against Larry Zbyszko in a steel cage match, we have one of the first big meetings between Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant. And that would be a match that would kind of define the business a couple of years later in the decade.
Right.
And so we almost see this Showdown at Shea in 1980, as a transition period from the era of Bruno to now we're getting fully into the era of Bob Backlund, but really of Hulk Hogan, kind of Hulkamania, kind of on the horizon.
It was on the horizon. Hulk Hogan at this time was a heel.
Right. He was still a heel here wrestling Andre, but that his career was kind of picking up steam a little bit. We were only a few years away from Hulkamania. I think really his first big run in 82 and 83 in the AWA is when Hulk Hogan would really kind of establish the character that would take him through the rest of the decade and beyond.
Good old Thunderlips.
Oh, Rocky 3, excuse me, Rocky 3. I about got my man card revoked. So this is really Bruno's swan song, at least for the first part of his career.
Yeah.
Now I brought this up several times. What basically ends up happening, Bruno retires in 1981. And he goes to work as a commentator for Vince McMahon Jr., Vincent K. McMahon, our Vince McMahon that we're familiar with today.
Mm-hmm.
But he has his son, David, who is also trained to be a professional wrestler. And so Bruno eventually comes back to help David get a break, get his start in the WWF. And this almost begins really a second mini career for Bruno. From about 1984, 1985 up to 1988, he's back in the ring wrestling again here at the height of Hulkamania. And so it's an entirely new opportunity for fans to watch Bruno kind of do his thing. But I think people need to understand too, Taker, Bruno was not just this slow lunk of a power wrestler. When you hear power wrestler today, you almost have two different images. One is a Braun Strowman that just wrecks stuff, and then you have the quintessential, slow lumbering power wrestler like a Dino Bravo, just so big and bulky, you just can't move around the ring. Bruno Sammartino was definitely,
he was in between those two. He was in between those two.
Exactly. He was a much better professional wrestler than people gave him credit for.
He could move. He was light on his feet. Plus, he could also destroy everything in front of him if he wanted to, because he had the strength to do so.
Exactly. Pro Wrestling Illustrated, famous magazine, began awarding the Match of the Year honors in 1972. And Bruno Sammartino won the very first Match of the Year award honor for the Battle Royal that he participated in Los Angeles. There was a big Battle Royal, 1972, that Bruno won. Battle Royals were kind of famous, especially in Los Angeles and San Francisco. So this was a big deal. Bruno would win Match of the Year honors multiple times during the 1970s. He won it for his match with Stan Hansen. He won for his title match with superstar Billy Graham. And, of course, he would win the honors for the last time in 1980 against Larry Zbyszko. So you're talking about a guy who's not only a great power wrestler, and he's not only a preeminent champion, but he's really one of the biggest attractions, especially in the Northeast during this era, that the company would ever have. And so when you talk about Bruno as a foundation, you really can't separate Bruno from the company that he helped build. If there's no Bruno Sammartino, we don't have a WWE today, at least not in the way that we see it.
Hell, WWE may have lost the Monday Night War if it wasn't for what Sammartino did, being the bedrock of the company.
Yeah, you can't separate the two. And it's interesting, we could talk a little bit here in closing about kind of the falling out that Bruno had with the company that he kind of helped build.
That was after his retirement, his initial retirement. A gentleman was fired from WWE, or fired from Capital Wrestling Corporation, which was WWF then. And word got to, and I'm not going to name names, I'm going to say a gentleman was fired, and we'll leave it at that.
Yeah.
That Vince Sr. reneged on gate percentages for his second title run. This is Bruno's. Bruno filed suit. It was settled eventually out of court after Sr. died. But in the agreement, Sammartino had to return to the company as a commentator. And he kept saying, nope, nope, nope. And then they offered a break to his son. That's how this all started. Now, David was, he got stuck in a shitty situation because he wound up basically in the shadow of his father when they started tagging together.
Yeah.
Bruno didn't want to put the tights back on. He was happy doing play-by-play or commentating. He was happy with it. Vince Jr. kept pushing and pushing and pushing. And finally, Bruno relented. And to say it was bad, I mean, it caused, and I still don't know, and I can't find it anywhere, it caused such a strain on the relationship between Bruno and David that they were estranged until Bruno's death, as far as I could find out, as far as I could see. Because because David wanted to be like his, wanted to be the guy, and he felt that his father was holding him back, and Bruno kept trying to back away, and Vince Jr. wouldn't let him. So so David left and went down to World Class Championship Wrestling as Bruno Sammartino Jr.
There's just so much going on in this period. This period in the company's history from 1983 to 1985. It's really, a fascinating era to kind of go back and explore, and not all of it is pleasant.
No,
This definitely, the falling out between Bruno and David would definitely be an unpleasant example. But, we're talking about the lawsuit that Bruno filed against Vince McMahon Sr. Of course, Vince McMahon Sr. Would pass away in, I believe it was 1984 or late 1983. There is a very seedy story involving the takeover of Vince McMahon Sr.'s company by Vince Jr. Basically, to kind of sum up, and this would definitely be a great topic for a future episode. Vince Jr. basically pulled a power play and forced his father out of the business.
Yep.
This is where the transition from Vince Sr.'s Capital Wrestling Group to Vince Jr.'s Titan Sports takes place. And so Bruno, when he settles this lawsuit to come back in, he's trying to help his son David. Now we're getting into the transition from Vince Sr. to Vince Jr. And the relationship with Vince Sr. would have its ups and downs, but there was no level of animosity quite like the friction that would develop between Vince Jr. and Bruno, especially in the late 80s.
Right.
The famous episode of the Donahue Show, Phil Donahue, there's a name from the past.
Yes.
They had a panel discussion on drug abuse and sex abuse scandals going on in the WWF. There was some stories about abuse from certain personnel, and we won't have to get into names because some of that after the fact was discredited, and
Right.
it kind of lived on as kind of an urban legend in the internet wrestling community. But there was a talk show hosted by Phil Donahue, and Bruno Sammartino was one of the most virulent critics of Vince McMahon Jr. and the direction he took the company.
Mm-hmm.
He would write about this in his autobiography. He called it a circus. He was a big proponent of the NWA in the late 80s. It was kind of a shocking break where Bruno would show up. He actually was a guest referee in a steel cage match at Halloween Havoc 1989. Thunderdome.
The Thunderdome match.
And so Bruno, of course, would make a few more appearances for WCW in the early 90s. But after that, really, Bruno just kind of fell off the radar. And it wasn't until the last few years of his life when Triple H reached out to him, kind of reforged some of those old connections, that Bruno was finally recognized for what he had contributed to the business.
Well, go ahead.
No, I was just going to close out there, saying, Bruno, it took a long time for him to get the recognition that he deserved. I'm very thankful as a fan of not only his, but of the business in general, that he really got that chance to kind of get that recognition, because as we've said throughout this episode, Bruno Sammartino, without Bruno, there is no WWF. There's no WWE as we know it today.
No. But the whole thing that he was, his biggest issues with WWF at the time was, yes, the direction that Vince Jr. was taking it. He criticized the use of the steroids, which were like flowing like candy back then. And
Yes.
The storylines were beginning to be more and more mature and vulgar in his opinion. He didn't like the words that were being used, the word bitch and other words. If you don't like someone, you don't have to use vulgar language, he would say, to make your point. Like you said, you brought up the Phil Donahue show. He was also on Geraldo, and he was on Larry King Live. And both of those are available on YouTube, because I've watched all three of them, actually, and they're all on YouTube.
Yes.
And this is where you hear Vince doing his double talk. And Bruno's having none of it. None of it.
Bruno is he's not taking any guff from Vince.
And thank God, God bless Base H, that we call him in the threads on Cage Side.
Amen. Absolutely.
He was able to convince Vince to get away from it. That and the USA Network and the sponsors, the people who pay WWE money to advertise, that he was able to move away from that. He got the wellness policy in place, and Bruno finally said, okay. And that was in, 2017 or 2016 that he was inducted?
Oh, that is a good question. I got that actually written down right here. 2013, he accepted the invitation.
Right.
So,
Okay.
yeah, so he had a good 4 or 5 years at the end of his life where he kind of reconnected with WWE. Of course, the famous statue that they made for Bruno that they unveiled at Access several years after the Hall of Fame.
Or actually, the next year, 2014.
You're right. It was 1 year later. And of course, I think Bruno's last appearance for the company was, oh goodness, 2015 or
2015 when he inducted Larry Zbyszko into the Hall of Fame.
Right, he was the inductor for Larry Zbyszko. He also appeared on an episode of Raw where they sang "Happy Birthday" to him in the crowd, which was really kind of sweet. It was almost like singing to your grandfather, almost.
Yep.
But we talked a little bit.
You talk about that. That was October 7th of 2013. That birthday, and they sang, "Happy Birthday" to him in Pittsburgh. But okay, ladies and gentlemen, 2013. Think about it. Here's a man who debuted in professional wrestling in 1959, retired from active in-ring competition in 1987. And in 2013, he is still known well enough and respected by fans today that he made an appearance, just an appearance. He didn't get in, and they sang "Happy Birthday" to him. That is just how awesome Bruno was. That's it in a nutshell. Bruno is awesome. If anybody says anything other than that, I have no time for you.
Yeah, it's kind of the love for the legend. It's a love for someone that was just such a big part of wrestling fandom for so many generations. And I've told the story before. Bruno Sammartino, his passing really hit me hard. Bruno was the guy that got me into wrestling history. I found his autobiography at the local library, and it was reading up on some of his experiences in wrestling through the 60s and 70s that got me interested in studying these different areas of wrestling history. And, it was through him that I learned about Vince Sr. I, learned of guys like George the Animal Steel for the first time, reading through this book, just some of the experiences that he had. So Bruno, I have a real strong connection to Bruno, even though I wasn't old enough to see him in his prime. Bruno kind of opened the door for me personally to becoming a fan, not just of the wrestling that I was seeing on TV, but of wrestling history in general. And so, Bruno, I hold a lot of respect for Bruno. I love Bruno Sammartino. He's just a fun wrestler to go back and watch. And there's so many different moments that we could cover in a future episode. Bruno, you can't break Bruno's career down in an hour and a half. It's just not possible.
It's impossible. There's so many things, like I said, Bruno is the bedrock of what we have today, WWE wise. He's still, even though he has passed, he is still holding the whole entire company on his shoulders. Proof positive, the Monday Night Raw after his passing, when they did the ceremony of the 10 bell, ring the bell 10 times. I have never heard an arena during one of those as quiet as that arena was that night. You could always hear murmurs, but that you could hear an absolute pin drop that night. You could hear the quintessential pin drop. And I'm sorry if I'm hitting hitting you in the feels there, Biff, but it hit me in the feels that night when the next morning when I watched it.
It did. Yeah.
It hit me in the feels hard because having seen this man wrestle myself live and on television, it's an experience that anybody that's had it won't forget.
Yeah, it's a rare thing in wrestling for one person to remain a heroic character to his entire career and be cheered as such. Uh, Bruno Sammartino was, the prototype of what a babyface would become in the 1980s, the 90s.
And the early 2000s, for that matter.
In the early 2000s, yeah. You have your Hulk Hogan's, your John Cena's, these powerhouse wrestlers that are kind of following the mold that Bruno helped establish. And you see Bruno, you see his legacy, his reputation, a man of high moral character, just the sweetest guy outside the ring, humble, gentle, just a genuinely good person that stuck to his guns. He didn't compromise who he was, and while that took him out of the wrestling spotlight for a long time, it kind of helped the legend that Bruno Sammartino carried with him. It helped it grow. Well, while he was alive, he was called the living legend, Bruno Sammartino. And so now, with his passing, this is akin to wrestling's Babe Ruth dying, or Lou Gehrig. This is just that big of a loss to wrestling. But even as we mourn the loss of Bruno Sammartino, we have a chance to really go back and through the internet explore just how great he really was. And he was a hero for so many different generations.
He was a what?
A hero.
Okay, I thought you said heel. I was like, what? Wait a minute.
No, he was in the mirror universe, maybe, but not here. No,
I misunderstood. That's why I asked.
It's my accent. I'm Conrading it up here today. He was the hero for so many different generations. A legend in Madison Square Garden, one of the all-time great draws. What can you say? We have so much more that we could talk about. Of course, we had his infamous feud with Randy Savage in '86 that we could cover. Talk about some of his steel cage matches with the likes of Gorilla Monsoon and George Steele. The entire section of his early 1970s career when he won the title back from Stan Stasiak. There's just so much to cover.
Like you said, this is not someone's life that we can cover in 1 hour, in an hour and a half, to an hour and 45 minutes. We just can't do it. I mean, there's just so much. I will say this, and I'm doing this without having spoken to you about it. Connoisseurs of Wrestling is going to have its own Hall of Fame, and Bruno is in. Period. In my book, he belongs there. He's the bedrock of the Hall of Fame that we have, and he will be the standard bearer for this Hall of Fame.
Yeah, that's got to be inaugural class for sure, and that's something we
could follow WWE's format. When they first started the WWF Hall of Fame, their initial person enshrined in it was Andre the Giant, and he was the only one that went in. Well, in ours, Bruno is the first and the only one that goes in this go round.
He is definitely deserving of the honor. He is deserving of a lot of respect. And, we talk about the purpose of this show. The Connoisseurs of Wrestling as a podcast, don't get me wrong, take or not, we love just shooting the breeze about old school wrestling. But that's not why we're doing this show. We're doing this show as much as an introduction to these topics so that you can go out and explore a little bit yourself. Our goal is to get you interested in some classic wrestling and kind of give you the spark that you need to go and discover wrestling like we did. Because we each grew up watching wrestling, but it was through our love of wrestling that we kind of explored, the history of the business that we might not have been privy to while we were fans growing up.
Yeah, I thank your great grandma and your uncles for that. They taught you right.
Yeah, and it's interesting that we mentioned that. I'm going to be driving to a visitation here in Georgia in just a little while for one of the uncles who was very much instrumental in that.
I have a suggestion for you.
Go for it.
Do you have any of your first magazines still that you bought as a kid? Wrestling magazines.
I do, and it's funny you bring that up.
Because I would say if it's an open casket, put it in his hands.
I was thinking
Send
the
him to
same
the
thing.
other side. Send him to the other side with something of yours.
I was thinking the same thing.
That's scary. We have the same thought.
Well, you got to remember something too. One of his big loves, aside from wrestling, was college football. He is a diehard Georgia Bulldogs fan, and I
can overlook that.
Well, be careful. I'm an Alabama fan.
So am I.
Oh, God bless you.
That's why I said I can overlook and be a Georgia fan.
Well, I had bought I had bought a little Alabama pendant that's got all the national championships, and I was going to take it with me as a gag. He would have appreciated it as the gag because we used to rib on each other about our sports teams. But definitely, I actually have one of the old Wrestling Eye magazines that he gave me. I keep a collection of magazines that my uncles gave me over the years, and I've got one of them that I'm going to take with me for real. It would be kind of a special remembrance little token because that was what it was about. It was family connection. It was passed down from generation to generation in my family and a lot of other families. And so,
unfortunately, my daughter has no interest, but my wife's children and my grandchildren have it. So I've got that.
The legacy continues.
Yes.
Well, that's what we're doing here on the Connoisseurs of Wrestling. We just want to give you a taste of some wrestling goodness and kind of send you off on your own way to explore. The more fans we get of professional wrestling, of classic wrestling, we keep that memory alive for all generations. And that's what we're going to be doing tomorrow. We have another very special episode that we're going to be recording. We have one of the best special guests we could possibly have, Taker, and I know you're excited about this.
I am.
A lot of our friends.
I'm looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to her knowledge in all of this. And that is my lovely wife, Legends Lover, is going to be joining us tomorrow to talk about AWA wrestling. And she lived in one of the main cities of it, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, during its heyday. So, yeah. And rumor has it there are photographs of her on Terry the Crusher Lasowski's shoulder at a bar that her father used to drink with him. Reginald Terry. She corrected me. Reginald Terry Lasowski, the Crusher Lasowski.
We are going to have to mine some of these stories tomorrow because there are just so many different ways we could go with that. But if you're listening live or you get a chance, you're definitely going to want to tune in to our episode tomorrow. Of course, we're going to be recording it tomorrow here for this brand new channel, the Connoisseurs of Wrestling. Tomorrow's show, the AWA. But we'll be back with Bruno again one day. We'll talk about some of his matches, and we got so much more lined up. Taker.
We've got 20 years of stuff.
Oh, at least. At least. I'm going to be a gray-haired old man by the time we run through everything.
I might be in the ground by the time we get done.
Well, yeah. Let's hope.
I'm being honest.
Well, let's hope that we can keep you alive long enough to get through all of this because there's too much for one person to cover, buddy.
Exactly.
Taker, it's been great. We're going to be right back with you again tomorrow for our special episode on the AWA with Legends Lover. The beautiful LL will be with us. That's going to be something you don't want to miss. Keep a check on us at Cage Side Seats, of course. Taker, where can they find you?
You can find me at Takers_Minion on Twitter. You can also find me every Saturday morning at 11 a.m. Eastern, 10 a.m. Central Time on Shooting the Breeze with my co-host and friend, Mr. Dr. Senju. There are several podcasts that we will be promoting here. I don't have it listed in front of me, so I apologize for that. Folks, get your information to me directly, and I will take care of it as soon as possible. Biff, where can they find you?
They can find me at Twitter at Real Deal Biff. That's RealDillBiffy. I don't know. That's just the name I chose. You can also hear me weekly Thursday afternoons, 4 p.m. Eastern, live on YouTube, the Queen City Express with Ryan Sayo. We'll be having full coverage of tonight's Backlash pay-per-view this week. So be sure to check that out. Of course, we drop new episodes of the Connoisseurs of Wrestling every week. We're having a special 2-shot this week to open up our new channel. And that's as much because of the issues I've been going through. We were delayed, unfortunately, getting this episode out. But we'll be getting new content every week. We hope that you're going to love this channel. Of course, be sure to check out all the affiliated podcasts at Cage Side Seats. There's just some great content. Be sure to join us in the daily and nightly threads. We're talking wrestling history all the time over there, and we would love to have you carry on some of these conversations. And of course, we have so many friends of the show, too many to name at one point, but just want to thank everybody that made our first episode such a great success. One of the most viewed shows that either one of us have done in a long time. And we're hoping that you continue to tune in and continue to enjoy what we're providing. We'll be back with you tomorrow with a special AWA retrospective. We got the beautiful LL with us. Be sure to be there or be hexagonal. For Taker's Minion, I'm Biff Kensington. You've been listening to the Connoisseurs of Wrestling. We'll see you tomorrow.
Keep it real, folks.